Welcome to this talk on the 6 thinking hats, which is a powerful tool, a powerful method of improving thinking in the classroom and indeed elsewhere. Supposing I were to ask you, what do you think is the most important invention that mankind has ever made? Well, you might say, of course, the computer. Computer can enable us to do wonderful things and getting better all the time. You might say a space rocket, which can enable us to go to the moon and beyond to Mars. There's all sorts of things you might say. But supposing I were to suggest to you that the bicycle, the very simple, humble bicycle, is one of the most important inventions ever. Now, my reasoning is simple, that what the bicycle does, and this will more or less look like a bicycle, what the bicycle does, it allows a human being to use his or her muscle energy in a much more effective way. In other words, the bicycle doesn't use any other energy, as indeed a rocket does, or to some extent a computer does, although a small amount of electricity, but to use human energy in a much more effective way. Now, of course, if we imagine 2 people having a race, and they set off to run the race, and let's suppose this is a rather fat person for the moment, the thin person will obviously or likely go faster than the fat person. But now if we train the fat person to learn how to ride a bicycle, then once that person has learned, that person will go much further and much faster than the person without the bicycle. Of course, there is a learning period in which the person learning to ride the bicycle may not do as well as he or she would have done without the bicycle. But what the bicycle does is to allow us to use our human abilities much, much more effectively. Even if we look at a simple ladder, what does a ladder do? A ladder allows us to use our human muscular energy to climb to higher places in a way that is much easier than we would have to do without a ladder. So these are ways of improving the use of our existing abilities, energies, skills, and so on. I'm going to put down some figures. Now, what I want you to do is to add all those up as quickly as you can. Just add all those up as quickly as you can. Nothing magical about it, simple arithmetic. Add them up as quickly as you can. Well, that's not so easy. But let's suppose I put them one under the other. Now that becomes much easier to add them up. Now, what have I done? I've simply changed the position, just put things in such a way that it is easier to deal with them. Just as simple as that. But it makes a huge difference. How we put things makes it much easier to deal with them. Let's look at another example. Suppose I ask you to add up the numbers going up from 1 to 10, all the way up to 10. Not too difficult, and you'd reach the answer 55. Supposing I said to you, let's make it a little bit more difficult, and I want you to add up all the numbers from 1 to 100. Well, it's easy, it's not complicated, you might make mistakes, it will take you a long time. But let's rearrange it. Let's rearrange it in a different way. And let's put our numbers going up. And this time, underneath, we'll write the same numbers going backwards. And all the way backwards. Now we add them up. We add the top line to the bottom line. We'll always get 101. Because as we add 1 on the top line, we subtract 1 on the bottom line, the total stays the same. When we've finished, we'll have 100 times 101, twice as many as we need, and the answer is 5,050. Now, there we're rearranging things so we can do something rather more complex and do it more easily. Now, that's what I'm going to be talking about, really, about how we can rearrange things in our brain, in our mind, so that we can think more simply and more effectively. There's no magic about it. We're using the existing brain ability as such. Let's for a moment look at the relationship between intelligence and thinking. And perhaps the best way of describing that relationship is to look at the relationship between a motor car and the driver. The horsepower of a car, the engineering, the suspension, all that is the potential of the car. Just as intelligence is the potential of the brain, possibly determined by the speed of transmission along the neurons in the brain. But the way the car performs does not only depend on the horsepower. The way the car performs also depends on the skill of the driver. The skill of the driver. You may afford to buy a very powerful car, but you may be a bad driver. You may only be able to afford to buy a much more humble car, and yet you could be a very good driver. So one is a potential, one is the skill with which that potential is used. Intelligence is the potential of the mind, thinking is the skill with which it is used. Now I've taught thinking to classrooms ranging from one class made up entirely of Nobel Prize winners, and at first they said, how can anyone teach us thinking? We've won Nobel Prizes. But at the end of 3 days they went away saying, yes, these things work, so much so that 3 of them then wrote forwards to one of my books. So at one end of the spectrum, very intelligent, very gifted children, we need to teach thinking, otherwise we're wasting that superb intelligence. At the other end of the spectrum, with youngsters of perhaps lesser intelligence, we also need to teach thinking in order to make the best use of what is there, and of course all in between. That is why in many countries now, the idea of teaching thinking as a skill is so established that by law every child in school must do 2 hours a week on thinking skills. So we're looking at thinking as a skill. You could also look at it as a form of software. If you buy a computer, you don't go home and say, I bought this wonderful computer and it's a Pentium 150 and it's got 3 gigabytes of storage, and you say, well, I really don't care about the software. Clearly, no matter how wonderful the computer is, without software you're not going to get anywhere. So what is the software that we use for the human brain? The most important computer of all, and indeed a vastly superior computer to any others, what is the software we use for that? And it's very limited and not really adequate for the functions that are necessary today. So we're looking at some sort of software for human thinking. Now, I'm going to describe a very, very simple form of software for thinking. It's widely used and it's very powerful. I'll just give you an example of just how widely used it is. Last June, I got 2 letters the same day. One letter was from the head of research of Siemens. Siemens is a big company in Germany. It's by far the biggest company in Europe. They employ 370,000 workers. Their annual turnover is $59,000 million. Big company. The head of research at Siemens wrote to me, and he said, we were using your 6 hats at our last top research meeting, and that was very successful. Same day, I get another letter from a young man called Simon Batchelor, who's in Cambodia, and he's there to help the Khmer villagers drill for water in their villages. And he could never get the villagers to be involved in the processes in the drill. They just weren't interested. And what he was looking for was some way of getting the villagers to be involved. He had his daughter with him, who was out of school, so he had one of my books called Teach Your Child How to Think. From that, he took the 6 hats, started teaching this to the Khmer villagers. Apparently, they became so enthusiastic, they said this is far more important than drilling for water, and the whole mission changed to teaching them thinking, teaching them the 6 thinking hats. Some days later, I was in Wellington, New Zealand, and the head of Wellesley College, one of their leading schools, says we teach that routinely to our 5-year-olds. So there we're looking at this framework of thinking which I'm going to talk about, which really goes across from top executives in one of the world's largest companies to 5-year-olds via Khmer villages.